Stalin executed blind musicians to silence one instrument. One survived. The instrument is called the Kobza. It looks like a lute, sounds somewhere between a guitar and a harp, and for 5 centuries it carried the entire memory of Ukraine in its strings. By the early 1930s, the Soviet Union wanted it gone. Not silenced, erased. The players were called Kobzari. They were almost all blind. In Ukrainian village culture, blindness wasn't just a disability, it was a calling. A blind child who showed musical talent was apprenticed to an older Kobzar, trained for years in memorization, instrumental technique, and a repertoire of epic songs called dummy. Dummy were not entertainment. They were oral history. Each dummy told a story: Cossack uprisings, Turkish captivity, peasant rebellions, families torn apart by war. Some were over 400 lines long, performed entirely from memory, passed master to apprentice across generations with no written text. The Kobzari were living archives. At any given time in the 1800s, there were perhaps a few hundred Kobzari active across Ukraine. They traveled from village to village, playing at markets, weddings, funerals, and religious festivals. They were respected figures, sometimes feared, sometimes revered, always listened to. When a Kobzar arrived, people stopped what they were doing, which leads to the sound itself. The Kobza had between 6 and 20 strings, depending on the regional variant. Some strings were plucked for melody, others droned continuously underneath, creating a haunting, layered resonance. Ethnomusicologists who later analyzed surviving recordings described it as neither major nor minor, a modal sound that doesn't map cleanly onto Western scales. There was also a second instrument, the lira, a Ukrainian hurdy-gurdy. You turned a crank, a rosined wheel rubbed the strings, and you pressed keys to change pitch. It produced a sustained, buzzing, almost organ-like tone. Many Kobzari played both instruments. Some specialized in one. Together, they define the sound of Ukrainian oral tradition. But here's where the story turns. The Kobzari didn't just play old songs. They composed new ones. And in the late 1920s and early 1930s, those new songs became a problem. Ukraine was undergoing forced collectivization under Stalin. Millions were being starved in what Ukrainians call the Holodomor, and the Kobzari were singing about it. This was the mechanism of the threat. A Kobzar could walk into a village market, sit down, and within minutes have 200 people listening to a song about grain being seized, about children dying, about officials lying. No newspaper, no pamphlet, no radio broadcast, just a blind man and a wooden instrument, and it was devastating. The Soviet authorities understood something most people miss about music. A written protest can be confiscated. A printed newspaper can be shut down. But a song memorized by a blind man who can travel anywhere, that's nearly impossible to censor. You can't burn a melody that lives in someone's head. So the crackdown began. In 1930, Soviet officials started requiring Kobzari to register with local cultural committees. They were told their repertoire had to be reviewed and approved. Songs that mentioned Cossack independence, religious themes, or criticism of Soviet policy were banned. Kobzari who complied were allowed to perform sanitized versions. Those who didn't were watched. Many refused. The dummy were sacred. They were the words of ancestors, and altering them was considered a betrayal. One Kobzar reportedly told a Soviet censor, "These songs were old when your country was young." He was arrested shortly after. His fate is unknown. This was the pattern: resistance, then disappearance. Which brings us to 1933. The most commonly cited account, preserved by Ukrainian émigré historians and later corroborated by dissident researchers in the 1980s, describes a Congress of Kobzari organized in Kharkiv, then the capital of Soviet Ukraine. It was framed as a celebration. Kobzari from across the country were invited to perform, to be honored. The invitation promised recognition. After years of harassment, many Kobzari saw it as a sign that the state was finally acknowledging their importance. They traveled by train, by cart, on foot. Some walked for days. Blind men with kobzas and liras converging on a city that was preparing to kill them. According to the accounts, the Kobzari were housed in a dormitory, fed, and told they would perform over several days at a formal concert. They rehearsed. They played for each other. For some, it was the first time in years they'd been in a room with other Kobzari. They shared songs, compared techniques, talked about the old days. Then, on the night before the scheduled concert, Soviet secret police entered the dormitory. The Kobzari were taken. Some accounts say they were executed in the basement of the building. Others say they were transported outside the city and shot. The exact number is debated. Estimates range from dozens to over 300. But the pattern was consistent. Not every Kobzar in Ukraine attended the Kharkiv Congress, but the event functioned as a template. Over the following months and years, Kobzari who hadn't been at Kharkiv were tracked down through registration lists, denunciations, and informant networks. They were arrested, imprisoned, sent to gulags, or simply shot. The instrument that had carried Ukrainian memory for 5 centuries was being systematically decapitated. And then came the physical erasure. Kobzas and liras were confiscated. Some were burned. Some were broken and thrown into rivers. Museum collections were purged. Recordings made by Ukrainian folklorists in the 1920s, some of the only audio documentation of authentic Kobzar performance, were removed from archives. It wasn't enough to kill the players. The sound itself had to disappear. Which leads to a detail that's easy to overlook but critical. The Kobza wasn't just an instrument, it was a construction of specific regional craft. Different villages had different string configurations, different body shapes, different tuning systems. When the Kobzari were killed and the instruments destroyed, that knowledge died with them. You couldn't rebuild a Kobza from a manual, because no manual existed. By 1938, the Kobzari tradition was effectively broken. Soviet cultural policy replaced authentic folk music with state-approved ensembles, performers in embroidered shirts playing sanitized versions of songs on standardized instruments. The Kobza was folded into a generic folk orchestra aesthetic. Its distinct voice, its modal tuning, its drone strings, its centuries-old repertoire. All of it was flattened into something safe and patriotic. During the German occupation of Ukraine in 1941 to 1944, there was a brief resurgence. The occupying authorities, seeing an opportunity to exploit anti-Soviet sentiment, encouraged Ukrainian cultural expression. A few surviving Kobzari re-emerged, but after the war, the Soviets returned and the suppression resumed. Any Kobzar who had performed during the occupation was treated as a collaborator. Some were arrested, others simply vanished. By the 1950s, there were perhaps a handful of authentic Kobzari left. These were elderly men, many in poor health, living in remote villages, playing for small gatherings. They had survived by keeping quiet, playing only for trusted neighbors, never in public, never for officials. Their instruments were hidden. Their repertoires were shrinking as memory faded. One of the last was a man known in fragmentary records as Petro. He lived in a village in the Poltava region. He had been apprenticed as a boy before the revolution, had survived the 1930s by hiding his instrument and pretending to be a simple beggar. And by the 1960s, he was one of the last people alive who could play the Kobza in its traditional form. In the 1970s, a Ukrainian ethnomusicologist found Petro and recorded him. The recordings are scratchy, low quality, made on a portable tape recorder in a village house. But they capture something that no longer exists anywhere else. The actual sound of the traditional Kobza, played by someone trained in the pre-Soviet tradition, singing dummy that had been passed down for centuries. On those recordings, Petro's voice is rough, unpolished. He sometimes pauses, forgetting a line, then finding it again. His Kobza playing is rhythmic and droning, with bursts of melody that rise and fall with the narrative. It doesn't sound like a concert performance. It sounds like someone remembering out loud, which is exactly what it was. Petro died in the early 1980s. With him, the unbroken chain of transmission, master to apprentice, voice to voice, across 5 centuries, finally broke. There were players after him, but they were reconstructors, not inheritors. They learned from recordings and academic descriptions, not from sitting at the feet of an old blind man for years. After Ukrainian independence in 1991, a revival began. Enthusiasts, scholars, and musicians started rebuilding the Kobza based on surviving instruments in museum storage, on the 1970s tape recordings, on written descriptions by folklorists. They relearned the tuning systems, They reconstructed fragments of dummy. It was an extraordinary effort of cultural resurrection, and it continues today. But here's the honest truth. What was reconstructed is not what was lost. The revival Kobza is an approximation. The reconstructed dummy are fragments. Maybe a third of the original repertoire survives. The specific techniques, the microtonal variations, the regional styles, the way a Kobzar would improvise within a modal framework, much of that is gone forever. You can rebuild an instrument. You can't rebuild a dead tradition's muscle memory. So why does this matter beyond Ukraine? Because it's a case study in how sound can be a threat. We're used to thinking of censorship as something that happens to text, books banned, articles redacted, words crossed out. But the Kobzari story shows that authoritarian regimes understand something deeper. Oral tradition is harder to control than written text because it lives in bodies, in memory, in movement. And when a state decides that a particular sound is dangerous, it doesn't just ban the instrument. It eliminates the people who carry the sound. It destroys the instruments. It removes the recordings. It replaces the authentic with the sanitized. It doesn't just silence the music. It makes the music look like it never existed. The Kobza didn't disappear because people stopped caring. It disappeared because a government decided it was a threat and acted on that decision with terrifying thoroughness. Petro's recordings still exist in an archive in Kiev. They're about 40 minutes of audio. 5 centuries of tradition compressed into 40 minutes of a blind old man remembering in a village kitchen. That's what survived. If you believe forgotten histories deserve to be heard, subscribe. I document the ones that nearly vanished.